Okay, so this is the key to section 1.6, part 1, and again, you want to solve each of these equations. Now, these are all polynomial equations, and in number 1, when solving this particular polynomial equation, again, you notice that I can factor out a GCF, so you need to factor this. In case, in fact, each of these you're going to factor. Um, so, so over here, I can factor out a 3. The 3 and 75, the GCF is 3. X to the fourth, x squared. For the variables, you take out the one with the smallest exponent, so you can take out an x squared. So I can factor out a 3x squared, and then I'm left with 3x squared times x squared is 3x to the fourth, minus 3 times 25 is 75, and then 3 times x squared times the negative 25 is a negative 75x squared, equals 0. Alright, now remember the next step is to see if you can factor this further. And so if you notice, x squared minus 25 is the difference of two squares. So I can rewrite this as 3x squared times x minus 5 times x plus 5 equals 0. Now again, notice for each step, you have to say equals 0, because these are equations. Okay, now the next step is to use what's called the zero factor property. And so the zero factor property says if you have two or more factors whose product is 0, then one of these has to be 0. So you got to set each one equal to 0. So we're going to say, I'm going to just go here. So we're going to say 3x squared equals 0, x minus 5 equals 0, and then x plus 5 equals 0. So you have to say each of these equals 0. You have to do that. Then here, by inspection, you can tell me what x is. 3 times what number squared is 0? Well, some of you can determine that that's just 0. X has to be 0. 0 squared 0, 0 times 3 is 0. Even if you didn't, you could do this. So if you couldn't figure it out, you could say, I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and then I get x squared equals 0. And then at that point, maybe you can see it now. Okay, what number times itself is 0? Well, the answer is 0. Even if you want to go further, you can, but you could stop at any of these points right here. You could take the square root of both sides, do plus or minus. These undo each other, so you get x equal the square root of 0, 0, plus or minus 0 is just 0. So there's one of your solutions. Over here, adding 5 to both sides, that's a linear equation, so add 5 to both sides, combine like terms, you get x equal 5. Over here, that's a linear equation, so subtract 5 from both sides, I get x equal negative 5. Alright, so 5 and negative 5 is 0. And so your solutions are 0, 5, negative 5. And it doesn't matter in what order. If they want you to put it in numerical order, you'd put negative 5 first, 0 first, and then 5 next. Alright, now over here, let's bring everything to one side, so it equals 0. So I get x cubed plus 2x squared minus 3x minus 6 equals 0. Alright, now remember when you have 4 terms, you want to factor by grouping. Factor by grouping. And so you're going to group the first two, group the last two. And so from the first group, I can factor out an x squared, and I'm left with x squared times x is x cubed, plus x squared times 2 is 2x squared. From the second group, I can factor out a negative, and then they have a 3 in common, so negative 3. And I'm left with negative 3 times x is negative 3x. Negative 3 times a positive 2 is a negative 6. And hopefully what you have here should be the same, and they are. And then that's equal to 0. Then these two parts here, these two terms, they have an x plus 2 in common, so I'm going to factor out an x plus 2. So you have x plus 2 times, and then you're left with x squared minus 3. Alright, now, these, see this x squared minus 3, if you compare it to x squared minus 25, this right here is the difference of two squares. Okay, I can factor it as these 25, I can factor it as integers. Here, that's not the difference of two squares. So what we're going to do, what's what we're going to do, remember, the zero, so we're going to use zero factor property. We're still using zero factor property. But we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So I'm going to get, over here, I'm going to get x plus 2 equals 0. And then I'm going to set this one equal to 0 as well. So x squared minus 3 equals 0. Okay. This is linear. This is quadratic. Linear is easy. I'm just going to subtract 2 from both sides. And so my solution, one of my solutions is negative 2. That's one of them. Here, quadratic, now see, since the x term's missing, I can just bring the 3 over and take the square root. So I can use a square root property here. I can just use the square root property. Now, if you wanted to use quadratic formula, you can. You would say A is 1, B is 0 since there's no x term, and your constant C is -3. But it's easier to use the square root property. To use the square root property, though, you got to bring the 3 over, and then take the square root of both sides, plus or minus. And so the square root and square root into each other, so you get x equal plus or minus square root of 3. And so you can say your solutions are at -2 plus or minus square root of 3, or if you wanted to, you can write them as 3 separate solutions. -2, comma, negative square root of 3, comma, and then square root of 3. Alright, next one. This polynomial 0 is already on the other side, so I'm going to group there are 4 terms, so I'm going to factor by grouping again. So I'm going to group the first 2, group the last 2. From the first group, I can factor out an x squared, and I'm left with 5x minus 1, because x squared times 5x is 5x cubed, x squared times a negative 1 is a negative x squared. Then we'll take out a positive 4, and I'm left with 4 times 5x is 20x, minus 4 times 1 is 4. Don't forget equals 0. Now hopefully what you have in parentheses are the same and they are, so you're going to factor it out. So I get 5x minus 1 times, now when I factor out a 5x minus 1, I'm left with x squared plus 4. Alright, now let's talk about this. So this is linear, I can't do anything else to this. Now be careful, don't say this is x plus 2 times x plus 2, because it's not. Remember, this is the sum of 2 squares. The sum of 2 squares you cannot factor. So you're going to do the same way we did this one, where we had x squared minus 3. That's not the difference of 2 squares, because 3 is not a perfect square. So we're going to set each of these equal to 0, just like we did this. You're going to do just like this. So I get 5x minus 1 equals 0, x squared plus 4 equals 0. This is a linear, this is quadratic, and notice the x term is missing. So we're going to use a square root property here. For the linear one, we're going to add 1 to both sides. So I get 5x equals 1, and so therefore divide both sides by 5. One of your solutions is 1/5. That's one of your solutions, comma. Over here, just like we did this, we're going to bring the 4 over to the other side, so I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. Combine my terms, I get x squared equal -4. Alright, just like over here, we're going to get x by 7, take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and put that here. Square root, don't forget plus or minus. The square and the square root onto each other, so you get x equal. Now remember, plus or minus. The square root of 4 is 2, and see, remember that's negative, so that's a 2i. Square root of -1, remember the square root of -1. Let's talk about this. So remember, this is square root of -1 times square root of 4. Square root of -1 is I. Square root of 4 is 2, so that's just 2i. That's it, plus or minus 2i. So you can leave your answer like this. So there are 3 solutions. You leave it like this, or you can write them as 3 separate solutions. 1/5, comma, 2i, comma, -2i. So you have a real number, and you have 2 imaginary numbers as your solutions. Okay, so that's going to take care of 1.6, part